I moved to my brother's apartment in Boston. And there I worked in a silkscreen factory, and I met two guys who were in a punk band called The Girls. They said, we need a musician, we need a fourth member. And so he said, do you know how to play music? I said, yeah, I mean, but I can play Bach, I can play, transcriptions of various Spanish music and John Dowland and lute music and early Renaissance music. He said, but why don't you try to play some this stuff? That's easy, just boom, 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 boom. I said, that I can do. The band, we performed at the Harvard dormitories, and that was very exciting. And I met a lot of the students there, and they were also kind of course, aware of all of this different kind of ideas in philosophy, painting, and music. So I got to New York, and then I met Basquiat, who was the first guy I met in New York City, because he was we played together in a band. I mean, his band opened for us. So we got to a club, and he was playing with some machinery, and I had to plug in my things, and he was plugging in his things, and so we started to talk about, what kind of music do you do? I said, we are more like electronic art punk. We're not really like the Ramones. And he said, yeah, that's what we do too. And we started to discuss these kind of composers. And then later that night, he took me around New York City, and then and he really was the first guy I met there. I didn't know he was a painter. And he didn't know I was a painter. After we played that time with them, the guitar player was Mark Dagley, who's an abstract painter. I said, we really can't live in Boston. We have to move to New York. We went to the MoMA, and we looked at Barnett Newman's and Rothko, and we saw all the art there, and I said, there's nothing like this in Boston. And there's also no energy, no artistic energy. So that's when we made the move I said, you can't be a rock and roll guy and make a transition into painting. It's okay now because we're 22 years old, we can do it. Nobody knows us. We got to New York, and we were looking for employment, and I found a job, and they said, and this job, it was in a gallery, and it was just for 2 weeks. And it was only to help with the archives, putting things in file cabinets. And the guy who ran the gallery, he said, can you write a press release for this Andy Warhol and his master printer? So I said, I can write one. So I wrote it, and they sent it over to there, and he said, oh, I guess Andy Warhol read it. He said, okay, tell this guy we want him to come here and write about everything that goes on. So I said, okay, great. So that was my new job. But then they asked me if I knew about silkscreen. I said, yeah, I had a job in Boston making silkscreens. So that's when I got to the job. I moved up to suddenly becoming like the guy who was diamond dusting. I went to California after that for about 9 months. I made a lot of paintings there. I had a show. Jean-Michel was there as well for his show with Larry Gagosian. And so I saw Jean all the time, and it was great because there were some New York rappers there, Ramalzi and all these guys, these graffiti artists. So we would hang out all the time there, and then his show was over and he left, and then I realized, okay, this place is boring. I went back to New York, and then I got a show in the East Village, 2 or 3 small shows. Then the guy called me and he said, Keith Haring and Andy Warhol came to your show and they bought 6 paintings. I said, oh, fantastic. That's great news. And Keith, of course, he wants to meet you. So I met him and we became very close friends. We were really good friends. And then Andy came to the studio one day, and I was working on this big painting that's now it's an Eli Broad collection. And so Andy came, he took a lot of photographs of me painting and working, and I didn't tell him I worked for him. I never wanted to tell him. But then I became good friends with him. When I was away from New York, I thought, I have to come back with something very different, very personal, very sort of, I have to make a radical change in what is happening here. And what was happening at that moment was a sort of new image painting, I guess they called it, where scattered images were around, like Schnabel, Salle, and fragmented images, but never a single iconic form. And I thought that's what I loved about Andy Warhol, that he was able to combine all these different concepts into a single form. So I thought that's what I need to do. I'd never been to Europe. And so I think it was, during 1983, my first trip was to Cologne. I stayed there and then I came to Paris. Once I saw the Louvre and once I went and looked at the paintings for real, and I'd gone to Spain at that point, I went to the Prado and started studying a lot more of the way the old master paintings looked. I realized, I always thought about Andy Warhol, that when he said to his mother, "What should I paint?" And she said, "Well, what do you like the most?" And he said, "I like Campbell's soup." And she said, "Well, paint Campbell's soup." And I thought, what do I like the most? I like old master paintings, so that's what I should paint. And so I just began these sort of fake old master paintings. And I painted a Madonna, and I painted things that looked like they were 200 years old. And you come in and you say, but it looks like it's 200 years old, but nobody would have painted that at that moment, during that period of time. So it must be new. And so there was paradox in the time zone, and it was about playing with time and imagery. And so I brought that kind of painting back to New York with me. Then, Robert Rosenblum, who, quite knowledgeable historian, he did a big book on the Musée d'Orsay when they opened, and the whole collection. I mean, he's the one that made the big book on the Musée d'Orsay. And so he says to me in New York, he said, "What do you call your kind of painting?" He said, "I mean, it looks like old master, it looks a little surrealist, it looks a little this, and what is it?" And I said to him, "It's artificial realism." And I explained to him a kind of an idea that I came up with about artificial realism that was somewhat based on somewhere between Hegel and Heidegger, and having to do with the self and the appearance, the being and the appearance of being, and the idea of sort of presencing of different time periods or references. So they were never really copies, or they only referenced things. And in a way, the presence of some other form of art existed within those objects. So when I lived in Paris in '85, Felix Guattari, he lived upstairs. And so Felix and I would have a lot of discussions about these kind of concepts as well. And he was working on his big book, Schizophrenia, when he was working at Louvre. He'd finished a book with Deleuze, and it was very interesting to have these kind of real conversations with real philosophical sort of masters. Because you couldn't have a conversation with Rembrandt about how's his painting and how does he feel, but you could have a conversation with Guattari about the idea of schizophrenia, for example. And so then I did this painting, because I'd already done a painting called The Great Schizoid. And so anyway, that was the evolution of philosophy into the art and this concept of artificial realism.